My name is M Nduku from the Pan-African Collective for Evidence. That's I think that leads us to basically a very good starting point in terms of explaining as well what the Pan-African Collective for Evidence is in that process. So the Pan-African Collective for Evidence is really an NGO or an NPO that is registered and is based in Johannesburg, South Africa. And really our key aim, our mission and vision is to reduce poverty and inequality in Africa. We are a team of about plus or minus 20 specialists. PACE is undergoing a rapid growth, which is really amazing. So from time to time, the team, grows beyond 20 to about 30, 35. When we draw on external consultants, depending on demand and the projects that we'll be working on. But again, I think PACE also, because of our belief in the partnership model, we also are the secretary to what is called the Africa Evidence Network. I'm sure some of the colleagues who are part of this this webinar are also members of the Africa Evidence Network, which is basically a community of close to plus or minus 5,000 different individuals who wear different hats. It could be decision makers, researchers, knowledge brokers, but all of them with an interest in supporting the use of evidence to drive decision making across the continent. And yeah, like I've said, this is our mission, essentially, to see the world free of poverty and inequality. And really, we kind of like work across essentially about four portfolios, if I may say. So there's capacities, community, syntheses, and in networks as well. But the idea is really to build, to promote the institutionalization of evidence to policy systems, ensuring that they do have a world impact on development and transformation. And again, as I've alluded to, this partnership model that we forms a key principle in terms of how we work. Also lends itself quite nicely to how we are the secretariat of the Africa Evidence Network. So that's essentially about PACE. We're here in Johannesburg. The center is led by Dr. Lawrence Langa, and some colleagues as well might also know. Again, speaking to this whole partnership principle and model, PACE will be co-hosting, for those who are aware, the Evidence Synthesis Infrastructure Collaborative meeting that is happening in June in Cape Town, and we're co-hosting this together with Cochrane, Campbell, JBI, and Acres from Uganda. So just to put the framing and kind of like highlight where PACE sits within the evidence ecosystem. And I must say, what I'm basically sharing here, it's important to recognize that this is a seriously collective insights from the wider PACE team. But I must extend my appreciation to our executive director, Dr. Lawrence Langa, who significantly contributed towards organizing all these lessons that we have, that I'm basically going to share this afternoon. Now, having said that, let's maybe talk about some of the things that we've basically done in the context of South Africa. And this is where the learnings are essentially or largely, coming from. One area that we have basically done in terms of the work and engaging policymakers in South Africa is compiling responsive and policy-aligned evidence map bases. This is likely the form of evidence maps, and here are some of the examples of the work that we've basically done. And this example highlight this work that we have done at both the national level and also at the provincial level, right? So yeah, those are some of the examples, and you see here on this picture on the left-hand side, this is the current president actually interacting with an evidence map at a conference maybe a year or two ago, and I'll talk more about the lady who's standing in front of the president and interacting there, showing him this map here, or the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence and Femicide. This is the work that within PACE was led by, who is currently the Director of Innovation and Equity, Andre Demantonsela. And that was a wonderful collaboration, as you can basically get see from the results here, with the what is called the Department of Planning, Monitoring, Evaluation in South Africa. This is at a national level. So this is this map that was done at national level, and then we also kind of like the second layer of things that we basically do is providing rapid response evidence synthesis. So those are some of the examples, and one that I'll just speak to is around COVID-19 responses. I mean, that was a highly critical point where evidence really was needed in a short time span, and we were able to do a rapid review on the impact of COVID-19 on transportation, and also just to understand how small and medium enterprises, SMEs, had responded, or the support that was provided globally towards these small entities as a result of COVID-19. We're able to do that. I think those two examples that I've just basically highlighted, one was at national level, and the other one was provided, was at subnational level, specifically provincial level. So we worked with what is called the Gauteng province, Gauteng being one of the provinces in South Africa. So worked with the national leadership, with the provincial leadership in co-producing that rapid response. And then we'll also support the institutionalization of evidence-based policy making, working with the Department of Planning, Monitoring, and Evaluation, whose research unit is headed by this lady here standing in front of the president. And then we also do sharing of capacities. We've done quite a number of training courses on evidence mapping, both for individuals in the private sector and also people within government. Quite a number over these 8 years. And lastly, facilitating communities of practice for evidence-based policy making. Again, going back to the work that we do within the Africa Evidence Network itself. And then, having said that, my apologies. So just to kind of like frame this whole approach that we're talking about, this co-production, it's really about embedded co-production that is actually pioneered and led by the center of government. And again, going back to the lady who's standing with the president, her name is Asha Doyao, who leads the research unit within the Development of Planning, Monitoring, and Evaluation. And she is the one who's responsible, in fact, for the development of this this document that you basically see with all these government logos. So we call this the Bible, actually, in fact, when it comes to the whole idea of embedded co-production with government departments. And if you want to learn more, please feel free. It's available online. You can access it, and it talks about all these key principles around, the Department of Planning, Monitoring, and Evaluation's approach to co-production. So, giving credit where it's due. And we appreciate efforts and leadership in driving this kind of work. And it speaks to quite a number of things that lead to the success of these processes around co-production and ultimately the use of evidence within the ecosystem. You need those evidence champions within these government entities at that level. So that is very helpful. And having said that, again, before we start talking about some of these lessons, it's again important to recognize what are the differences between, just your, for the lack of a better word, this for now, just your let me call it normal co-production. But, the embedded co-production that we are basically speaking about here, this one is a model that was developed by a government agency, the Department of Planning, Monitoring, and Evaluation, really with the primary aim of enhancing state capacity, country's capacity, and also evidence use. So it's important to recognize, because this is ultimately not just about improving the research per se, but also just moving on this co-production process project was really commissioned and led by civil servants. So that's important to recognize. And what it leads to then is, essentially the evidence users' needs and context actually shape and drive the project itself. And one thing that I would, kind of like emphasize, if we want to speak about, the steps in developing, say, these evidence bases, one of the crucial steps is where, when you're doing normal evidence synthesis, be semantic review or evidence map, we just say, I think the first step is clarifying the scope and the question and all of that. For that specific question, for that specific process for embedded co-production, it's, we call it development of the policy narrative. So it's slightly kind of like different, but it encompasses all these different elements, clarifying the question and all of that. But what becomes critical now with this type of approach is that that process is important to ensure that these evidence bases actually have that political legitimacy that they deserve, so that we enhance the probability of them being used by the decision maker. So involving them from the onset up to the end. So I just wanted to speak to this process, idea of policy relevant developing the policy narrative. And that process is also a two-way process. Everyone is collectively engaged because we need to understand, okay, what is the intended purpose of this map? Who can potentially use this map? And that all that shapes even how you eventually produce and visualize the map itself, because it needs to have, different contributions from the users themselves. So just to emphasize that point. And then lastly, this co-production approach, might be seen as, it's done for once-off projects to fill ad hoc decision making needs, but also as an ongoing public sector knowledge management, using these evidence bases as knowledge management tool as well. Because having those evidence bases, what we have seen from experiences after developing them, at some point, sometimes you can't really foretell when this happens, but specific requests then emerge. Maybe the minister or, someone who's working within a particular unit can, pose some questions that, can be answered by that evidence map. And then what does it do? Because you already have the evidence base, then the Department of Planning, Monitoring, and Evaluation will be able to respond to these questions as need be. And then, let's talk about the lessons then themselves. The first lesson being the deficit of the deficit model, essentially. What is it that we're talking about here? It's important that we recognize, and I would say we are at least at my personal level, guilty of some of these things where we assume that we speak on behalf of the people as researchers, in contrast to, the civil servants themselves. And we always assume being critical is, kind of like the default position that we take. And again, researchers kind of like assume, we have all the technical expertise and are really the custodians of rigor. In a way, we just say, might not say it out loud, but inherently we might be feeling like, we know better than them, right? But there's a risk there, right? In its sense, because, the policymakers themselves might actually be in a better position when it comes to some of these aspects. They might have a more activist background than you, and they would understand, better what is possible given the political and economic realities of, the country. The reality is we, for example, I work in South Africa. I got into the space evidence mapping in South Africa, but I'm not from here. I'm actually from Zimbabwe. But working with the policymakers in South Africa, the reality is they will have a better understanding of the political and economic realities of this country, right? And also recognize that these civil servants actually would also be under pressure to deliver high quality work in a very short time frame with non-flexible deadlines, which compared to kind of like researchers and more, let me just say academia, you also work under, under pressure. In our context is also, they face the same reality and the pressures, right? And even more for them, the pressure is even higher because they have a public mandate to implement policies and programs, because they've been voted in by the people, right? So essentially, that's some of the aspects that we talk about, understanding the deficit of the deficit model. But coming back to this idea where we feel as researchers, as academia, we have more technical expertise and the custodians of rigor, but we also recognize civil servants, policy colleagues, when given the need and the mandate to deliver reports, say to the government, to the cabinet, the same risk that you'd have as an academia to send in your paper for peer review, right? So there are similarities in terms of the way of working, the skill set between researchers and the policy colleagues or civil servants that need to be recognized beforehand. That influences how you engage with them. Because again, really, it's really a matter of sometimes you need to, get down from this high horse where we'll be. And that is important for cross-learning when we engage with these policy colleagues. Second lesson is about managing interactions and capacities. And we recognize co-production itself, the one that we're talking about here. It does not necessarily come naturally, but it can be managed or even engineered into existence. And it's important that we recognize the idea is really trying to provide technical and scientific structures for a messy and nonlinear process of co-producing. So it's not that linear. There's so many factors that come into play, right? Simply could be personalities even, they come into play, some of those different elements as well. So it's important to recognize, and co-production is not a romantic ideal, but a means to an end. It's important that there's careful management of these interaction and mandates between, on the side of the policy colleagues or civil servants, on the side of the researchers or the academics, personalities and skill sets, both soft and hard, they also need to be managed carefully. I always want to, kind of like talk about this idea that, sometimes when we introduce, maybe before we even talk about evidence mapping, just the idea of evidence synthesis, we love it because it's our work, it's our bread and butter. But sometimes when you get into some of these meetings, conferences with policy colleagues, they're not really as excited as you think they will be when you share this idea. Maybe it's because personally, for me, I was really captivated by this whole process when I got introduced to it, and it made sense to me. So sometimes I struggle when I don't get the same reaction with kind of like policy colleagues, maybe because they are used to a different type of evidence that is being put on their table. And it's the reality. There are there's different organizations, entities that are providing different type of evidence. Some are just providing like primary studies, and we know the dangers of a single study. I mean, this idea has been talked about quite a bit. Maybe it's one thing that they are used to. So when you interact with such kind of individuals, it might take a lot of convincing to, kind of like buy in the idea of evidence synthesis as well. So just to give some practical examples there in terms of differences and, and personalities and understandings as well. And then lesson 3, we have actually noticed that co-production, the one that we're talking about, embedded co-production, it actually challenges within the context of South Africa, at least challenges a procurement system that is actually set up for a consultants culture and, for consultants themselves, because that is the way things basically are done. But then it becomes a question where, when we talk about co-production, evidence synthesis, within the context of at least how we approach the whole idea of, promoting EIDM, for as a long-term investment, something that we would love to see being sustained over a long period of time. So that's why some of these then items become really important, where we see terminations of contracts based on soft skills, or lack of trust. Maybe at least just putting across these questions. How can we basically do that? Because there might be a mismatch, right? And the other question is really, how do you build deep and trusted long-term relationships when there are some contracts that are, being flagged for corruption? And that's, again, the reality that we have to deal with. And both these are key risks for the sustainability of embedded and long-term co-production, right? Because having established that relationship, like I'm saying, we have produced a particular evidence map. It's a knowledge management tool. In as much as it might sit within all these government departments, if, say, PACE has co-produced that particular evidence map with that unit, perhaps at national or subnational level, maybe the request for a rapid response after a year or two, who is better placed, to be able to co-produce that rapid response to whoever might have requested it. One might argue, whoever was involved in developing that evidence base is better placed. But, like we've said, some of these things might change in terms of, entities that end up working with the same departments that we've been working with. Moving on to lesson 4, I think just again, what we feel is important, right, within universities, it's important that, there's need to market policy access and policy success as much as research success. And really, these spaces, these entities should not be ashamed to do so, right? So essentially, it's more of, let's try to find ways to incentivize academic institutions to recognize, to promote the use of evidence more explicitly. And that's the idea around policy access and policy success, rather than just, aiming for pushing publications that might just end up in shelves at the universities, right? Maybe it's also high time that there's a strong push to attract the brightest or the most policy sensitive or policy dedicated individuals within these universities, within these academic institutions as well. And in the long term, it becomes extremely important that, there's consideration of the role of academia in society. But I think kind of like at the basic foundation level, it's really about ensuring those incentives currently exist, so that we have more people within this academia with more professors being engaged in research that, ultimately influences policies that will impact the lives of the people. And this is really my final slide, and kind of like in conclusion. So as we move forward, some of the things that we kind of like need to think about, some of the things that we might want to drive, let's recognize the difference between using co-production to make research more relevant to policy, that is research-driven co-production, and actually using co-production to enhance policy decision needs with evidence. Decision maker-driven co-production, that's the latter being the ideal. Need to co-produce in such a way we address policymakers' needs. Co-produce in such a manner that we provide relevant evidence that actually makes a difference. So yeah, and as much as we talk about offending, failing, being shared equitable, if we maintain a practice in which most co-production is actually initiated and conceptualized by academia or academics, then yeah, we're really going in the wrong direction. And in that case, It's because of obvious reasons, because we are not really putting the evidence users or the decision makers' needs first. So let's prioritize and imagine that world where we see decision maker driven co-production more than research driven co-production. Let's think about planting more researchers within policymaking organizations, not to do research, but do other things, promote EIDM, promote EIPM, whichever way you might want to put it. And also vice versa. We have secondments, rapid response units, just that force learning opportunities, cross-sharing of ideas, and also ensuring professional norms and practices of the policymakers themselves. They actually embrace a rapid learning culture and also the associated skill sets. And yeah, just speaking about that, I think us as an organization, at some point, we reflect on some of the things that we do and really feel we can be proud of. We worked with what is called the Western Cape government, Western Cape being another province within South Africa. And through our engagement, that is also part of the examples that I highlighted earlier on. But in us sharing the idea of developing these evidence maps, developing these evidence bases, obviously there will be elements of capacity building and all of that that speaks to these associated skill sets. And we're really proud to say, after doing maybe 1, 2, or 3 evidence map with them, they've expanded and they're now doing, the sky's the limit for them. Sometimes we just see, now they're presenting at this particular webinar conference and they're presenting, quite a number of evidence map, more than what we kind of like co-produce with them. And again, I think it's really important to acknowledge that there was, we dealt with individuals who had, the drive to learn and apply the skill sets that they'd learned. And another idea, this comes to the norms and practices. Also, for the researchers themselves, these need to be geared towards making full policy engagement a non-negotiable, because that's the only way in which we can essentially drive EIDM to as many lengths as would like, essentially. Colleagues, I think I will basically stop there. Thank you so much for listening. Please get in touch with us. But for now, I will hand over back to Johanna, and yeah, I think we have time for questions and discussions, etc. Thank you so much, colleagues, for listening.